Hello everyone, welcome to this week's video, and today I just want to talk about one of the best, if not the best, mobile filmmaking app, Filmic Pro. Now before we begin, I'd just like to add that this video is not sponsored by Filmic Pro, but if the guys at Filmic Pro are watching this, then Now what makes Filmic Pro special is that it allows you to have full control of your shooting when using your mobile phone, and you can control things like shutter speed, white balance, and so on. Now today's video is probably going to be longer than usual, so grab a snack and let's jump straight into it. Okay, so when you first open Filmic Pro, this is the screen that you're met with. It has a couple of elements on screen and we're just going to go over them one by one. We're just going to start with settings. When you open settings, you have a couple of options. First one is video. Up here you have your aspect ratio, so you can select the actual aspect ratio that you want to shoot with, and if you want your video to be cropped to that aspect ratio, you just come down here and select the crop source to overlay. So what happens when that option is not selected is that you just have guidelines on screen showing you what that aspect ratio would look like, but the final file is recorded in 16:9. When it's selected, it crops the video to that aspect ratio. Let's move on to the tabs below that, where you have your resolution. Now here you can select a couple of resolutions depending on what your phone supports. Okay, so next to your resolution you have the bit depth, and if your phone supports 10-bit, you're going to have the 10-bit option here. My phone doesn't support 10-bit, so I only have 8-bit SDR. If you have 10-bit HDR, then I would suggest you shoot on that because it's just going to have a much higher quality video, and it's also going to give you much greater leeway when color grading in post. Now let's move on below that, where you have the bit rate, and basically what bitrate means, it's just the amount of data that's recorded per second in your video. So here you're just gonna want to select the highest you can, but do keep in mind that the higher options also come with larger file sizes. Now below the bitrate is the codec. Here you have two options, and you can use either H.264 or HEVC. Now from my experimentation, I think HEVC gives you smaller file sizes. Next is noise reduction. Noise reduction just basically tries to minimize the amount of noise on your video, and I would suggest you leave this at minimal or fast. Same for sharpness. Just try it out and see what works best for you. Moving on to the next tab where it says frame rate. Here is where you're going to be able to select the frame rates that are supported by your mobile phone. Also keep in mind, if your phone records certain frame rates only at certain resolutions, then you're going to want to come here and select that resolution so those frame rates can show up here. Below the frame rates, you're going to see your capture FPS and your playback FPS. Basically what it means is your capture FPS is the frame rate that your video is captured in from the camera, and your playback FPS basically means what frame rate that video is played back at. So if you select something like 60 frames per second for capture FPS and then you use a 24 playback FPS, that video is going to be slowed down. And then below your capture and playback FPS is your auto shutter. Now I usually leave it on auto shutter, but if you're experiencing any flickering of lights in your scene, just try seeing which one of these works. Going back up here where you see your frame rates, there's the standard and time-lapse option. Now standard just means you're recording normal speed video, while time-lapse is just what it sounds like. It's a time-lapse, and you have the options up here to select the interval that your camera shoots the time-lapse. So if you select, let's say 1 second, it's going to shoot 1 frame for every second. So you can see down here your playback FPS is 24 frames. That means to get 1 second of video, it's going to have to shoot for 24 seconds because it's getting 1 frame for every second. And that just applies for all the other seconds. So if you select 5 seconds, it means it shoots 1 frame every 5 seconds. Okay, now that we're done with the video section, let's move on to audio. And here is basically just where you're going to be able to change your audio settings, select the microphone that's recording. Below here you can select the kilohertz of the audio. Below there you can select to record only video. You can also select the option to process your voice, but I would suggest you don't do that and just do that when you're editing. You can also select headphone monitoring, and what that means is if you have any headphones connected to your phone, you're going to be able to hear what your microphone is picking up. And that is very clutch for monitoring if your audio is clipping or if it's too long. Below that, you have an option to notify you if you're recording silent audio or if there's no audio at all in your scene. Now let's move on to hardware. Hardware is more about the hardware that you can connect to your phone and use it to the Filmic Pro app. So you have stuff like DJI Osmo Mobile, which is your gimbal. So you can select all these and connect them to the Filmic Pro, and it makes it much easier to use the controls on the hardware to control your Filmic Pro app. There's also a couple of options below here. If you're using an anamorphic adapter, you can de-squeeze the footage right here on your phone. You can also flip your image. So yeah, moving on to device. Here is where you're going to be able to lock your orientation. Orientation lock basically means if you're shooting in landscape and you want it to remain landscape, regardless of whether you turn your phone, you can lock that. You can also stitch recorded footage. That is just going to make one clip out of all the clips you record. You also have the option to GPS tag your video. You can also mute notifications so they don't affect your audio recording. You can also select the volume keys to trigger recording. Okay, now moving on to presets. This is where you're able to save your presets. So maybe if you have a preset for 1080p 24 frames per second or for 4K 60 frames per second, this is where you're going to be able to find them, and that allows you just to quickly select between the different presets instead of going to video and adjusting all those settings every single time. Moving from presets to stabilization. When you open stabilization, you're going to have a couple of options: optical image stabilization, electronic image stabilization, and those two combined. Now, optical image stabilization is mechanical stabilization happening at your lens, and this is going to give you the best quality. Electronic image stabilization just digitally crops into your video and uses software to stabilize it. It does work sometimes, but most of the times it can introduce digital warping, so I would suggest you use optical image stabilization here if your phone supports it. Now let's look at the CMS plus frame.io, and what this does is it just allows you to manage your content. So you can name your scenes, you can name your sequences, and that is going to allow you to have an easier time organizing your files. Okay, let's look at interface. So interface here, basically it's just pertaining to the interface you see when you're using Filmic Pro. Yeah, you can select to show touches. You can also select what color you want for basically the elements. Also for your framing tools, you have rule of thirds, diagonals, cross, broadcast. You can select any of these, and these are very great tools for composition. Personally, I usually use rule of thirds. You can also have focus assist. Focus assist basically just magnifies your video when you are manually focusing, so you can better dial in the focus. You also have preview active. That just means that you can see what you're recording. If you turn that off, the app is going to be just blank. You can also tap to hide interface. When you tap, all the elements on screen disappear. You can hide the zoom rocker. You can swipe for manual controls. Okay, there's information, and information is just basically information about Filmic Pro, quick start guide, the tutorials, the support page, and the contacts. Now that we're done with the settings, let's look at the actual home screen of Filmic Pro. Let's start here on the left. You're going to see the square over here, and basically what this does is it affects the reticles for exposure, this one, and for focus. So you can select center weight, and center weight is just going to keep them at the center. So the exposure will expose for whatever is at the center, and focus will also focus on what's at the center. Now, when you select reticle, it allows you to independently move them in the screen. So I can expose for this part of the screen while focusing on a different part. So wherever you put the focus square, that is where it's going to focus, and wherever you put the exposure bracket, that's where your camera is going to meter for exposure. Now, the third option for the reticles is manual. And manual basically just allows you to have full control of your exposure and your focus. Here on the left is where you control your exposure. So you have your level. Basically, level just controls ISO and shutter speed at the same time. If you want to control ISO on its own, you can just select it down here and you can lower it or increase it. Just remember that lower ISO will give you a generally sharper image, while higher ISOs are going to introduce noise to your video. Okay, below that is shutter speed, and here you can select your shutter speed. Lower shutter speeds are going to give you a much brighter image, while higher shutter speeds are going to give you a darker image. But also, lower shutter speeds will introduce more motion blur than your higher shutter speeds. Okay, and below shutter speed is zoom rocker. The zoom rocker allows you to zoom in and out. Also, what's interesting about the zoom rocker and the focus rocker, we'll get to it, is that it has these two elements that you can see here, the red one and the green one. What those allow you to do is set points for your zooms. So let's say I wanted to zoom from here to here. What I can do is I can use these red and green lines, and then that zoom motion is going to be done automatically by the camera app. Let me show you how to do that. So this is my starting point. I tap it, and if I want this to be my end point, I just tap that. So if I want to automatically zoom between these two elements, I just tap. If I'm at the green line, I can just tap the red line and it's going to automatically zoom there, or the inverse. Now you might notice it is zooming very quickly. So if you want to adjust the speed at which it zooms in, just tap the numbers there and you have this menu pop up here. So up here is just generally going to show you the zoom rocker, and you also have your points, your green point and your red point where you place them. Below that is the speed controls for the zoom rocker. So now here we're just at a medium speed. If I select a slow speed and I zoom between the 2 points, you're going to see it's now zooming at a much slower speed. So that's interesting because you don't have to touch the phone. On the right side of the screen, you have your focus rocker, and this basically just allows you to change focus. So you can focus closer or further, or you can just dial in the focus and leave it locked so it doesn't change during your shot. You also have the same thing as a zoom, which means you can set points. So I can set 1 point there and another point where you have the car in focus, and then I can just move between the 2 focus points very easily. And just same as the zoom rocker, you can tap the numbers here and you're going to have your settings for speed. So if I set a slower speed, the rack focus is going to be much slower. Okay, so now that we are done with exposure and focus, let's move on to down here where you have the colorful square. And when you tap that, you're going to have this menu pop up. Let's go to the first option. The first option is the white balance options, and this is basically where you can dial in your white balance of your image. So if the colors in your image don't appear to be true to life, this is where you can balance them to appear just as how you see them. So you have your options for tungsten lights for shooting in the sun on a cloudy day, fluorescent lights. So in these two options here, A and B, allow you to set your own white balance options, so you can always quickly jump between them. Now right above them is your options for tint and your temperature. So this is kind of where you can change the tint. So if your image is a little too green, you can add a bit of magenta here to cancel it out, and vice versa. To the left of that tint rocker is your white balance rocker. So here you can set the actual white balance here. So if your lights are maybe, let's say 5600 Kelvin, you can white balance that here. And also you have an option to lock that white balance, which is the AWB over here. When it's on blue, it means it's automatically white balancing all the time. When it's on red, it means it's locked. So your white balance is going to stay the same regardless of what you do. I mean, when it's on orange, then this means that The white balance is auto adjusting all the time, but once you press record, it locks your white balance. And below your white balance settings, you're going to have your LUTs, I think. So this is where you can buy these certain looks, and these will apply on your footage, as you can see over here. So yeah, usually I don't use any because I like to color grade in post. Down below there is going to be your options for shooting in log or flat. Now I'd recommend, if you don't have any knowledge in color grading, either shooting native or dynamic. These other options, natural, flat, and log, are going to need you to stretch the image in post. Below there, you can select how dark you want your blacks to be. So you can fade them, or you can crush them. Also the same thing for your highlights. You can also raise your shadows, lower them. Same for your highlights. Okay, now below that is LUTs. And what this is for is it allows you to attach your own LUTs and see what those LUTs would look like in post. But it won't burn that LUT into the footage. Your footage is still going to be flat or native, whatever profile you're shooting in. But if you do select burn in here, then it's going to burn that LUT into your footage. I would suggest you just leave it on preview. Okay, now we are done with the white balance and recording profile settings. Now let's look at this eye icon over here. When you tap that, that's going to allow you to change between the different lenses. You can change between the front lens and the back lens. Okay, next to it is going to be your remote options. So let's move on right here to the middle. And here in the middle, it basically just shows you your recording time, your battery status, and your storage status. As you can see, my storage is in the reds. And it also shows you the frame rate and the resolution you're recording on here on the left. If you tap it once, it also is going to give you your histogram, and this is very useful for exposure, so you can dial in your exposure very correctly. If you tap it again, it's also going to give you your waveform. Your waveform is very important for exposing your image, so make sure to use that. Moving to the right of there, where you have this A, when you tap it, it's going to bring up this menu where you have off, and off just means there's no assisting options. Let's just start at the very far right, and I'll show you why. So you have FP, which is focus peaking. Focus peaking just uses these green lights to show you where your camera is focusing. Okay, let me try to manually focus. So if I manually focus, you're going to see the green lines disappear. So basically where the green lines appear is where your lens is focused. Next to focus peaking is going to be false color, and false color is very important for exposure. Just think of it as going from the dark purples to red, dark purples being blacks and reds being the brightest parts of your image. Next to it, you're going to have zebras. Zebras are also important for your exposure. Basically, if you see zebras on any part of your image, it means that part of the image is overexposed. So you can dial your exposure in a little bit more. Now, let me show you why we started at the very right. We have this reactive option here. And the reactive option, when you select it, it seems to do nothing, but it doesn't really do nothing. What it does is, it doesn't show any assisting features on the screen up until you start doing things like focusing. So now if I start to focus, it's going to bring up those focus assisting features. You can see the green lines that show where I'm focused on. And same thing if I try to do exposure, you see. So we have zebras where my blacks are crashing. And we also get zebras where my highlights are overblown. Okay. Next to your assistance features is going to be the play. And this is basically where you can play all your recorded files from and preview them. Okay, next to the play button is going to be your record button. And this is what you use to record video and stop recording. And above your record button is going to be your audio monitoring levels. This is where you can monitor your audio levels and see if they're clipping or if they're too low. And right above that is going to be your microphone icon. And basically you can just use this to adjust your audio recording levels. Now going to the left, you're going to have your grids, and this is where you can activate your grid features for composition. Okay, moving on, you have this tab here at the top that you can hide or drop down, and it has a couple of features. Let's just go over them. You have ISO at the very left, then you have your shutter speed, you have your white balance. It can also show you the number of minutes you have left to record. It's also going to show you the codec you're recording in and the profile that you're recording in. So if you tap ISO here, you can adjust your ISO settings quickly from this menu. Same thing for your shutter speed. Next to your shutter speed is going to be your white balance. You can also control your white balance from here. You can select your recording from there. You can also quickly change the recording profile from here, from your native to your flat to your log, whichever one. Okay guys, that is Filmic Pro and all its features. It is a very great app. I've been using Filmic Pro for the longest time right now, and I would highly recommend it to anyone. If you're someone who primarily shoots on your phone, I think you can get a lot from Filmic Pro, so give it a try and let me know what you think. Just one thing to keep in mind is that it is not a free app. They used to have a one-time purchase license before, but right now they are doing a subscription model. You have an option to subscribe weekly or yearly. I think the weekly subscription is $4 Canadian and the yearly subscription is 67 Canadian dollars. If you're going to get Filmic Pro, I would highly suggest you look into the yearly subscription. That is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. You can also try the weekly subscription to see if Filmic Pro is for you. I hope you learned something today or you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, share, comment. And if you're not already, please subscribe so you can get future updates on my videos. Till next time, remember to be kind, stay creative, and I'll catch you on the next one.